No headstone with a name on it that anyone trusts. Just a grave containing the remains of a man whose skull should be there, but isn't. That man was Captain William Andrew Jarvie, the first man executed in Dunedin, hanged on the 24th of October, 1865. More than 30 years later, his body was exhumed and prepared for reburial. Somewhere between the old jail and Northern Cemetery, his skull was reported missing. How does the skull of Dunedin's first hanged man end up missing during an official reburial? In broad daylight, without anyone ever being named? Every old cemetery has legends, but before I believe any of them, I want to know where the legend actually started. Did something real happen first, and then on top of that the legend grew? This one starts with a murder, an execution, and then a reburial, and a human skull that simply wasn't there when it should have been. A headless sea captain tied to Dunedin's Northern Cemetery and the old jail asks a more specific question than most legends bother with. Because when Jarvie's remains were finally moved to Northern Cemetery, decades after his execution, his skull was reportedly gone. Not damaged, not accounted for, but gone. It could have disappeared soon after the hanging, during the move itself, or simply through poor records in a city quietly building over its darker corners. Nobody ever recorded which. Before we chase the legend, we chase the gap in the record. And before we ask who might have taken the skull, we need to ask why anyone would have wanted it in the first place. Jarvie wasn't just another prisoner. He was convicted of poisoning his wife, Catherine, with strychnine. He was tried twice, sentenced to death, and became the first man ever executed in Dunedin. That kind of notoriety didn't end in the gallows. In the 19th century, the bodies of notorious criminals did not always get to simply disappear into the ground. Now, Jarvie moved through Tasmania, Victoria, and New Zealand before taking command of the Titania, trading around the lower South Island. On paper, he looked respectable enough. A profession, a family, a ship, and a place in a fast-growing port city. But Catherine Jarvie's death was not the first allegation later associated with William Jarvie's name. Dr. Thomas Hocken later wrote that Jarvie had already been suspected in Tasmania of the deaths of several illegitimate children. I couldn't find evidence that those allegations were ever tested in court, and they remain part of the darker historical claims surrounding his life rather than proven crimes. One story from the earlier period has become almost legendary. Jarvie once reportedly fell into the Otago Harbour near Carey's Bay and had to be rescued. Afterwards, he was said to have remarked, "If a man is born to be hanged, he will never be drowned." Whether those words were ever truly spoken is impossible to know today. But if they were, history would prove them chillingly prophetic. Now the trail leads back to Caversham, only a few kilometres south of central Dunedin, on the evening of the 26th of September 1864. Catherine Jarvie fell violently ill and died. She was pregnant. She was 39 years old and had been married to Jarvie for 15 years since she was a young woman in Hobart. Before she became evidence, Catherine Jarvie was a wife and a mother, dying in her own home with her children close by. At first, nobody called it murder. Dr. Hardy recorded her death as seizures. Now start with the poison, and the weeks before Catherine died, Jarvie bought strychnine from a chemist twice. He said it was for rats on the ship. On its own, that explanation was plausible. Ships had rats, and strychnine killed them. After Catherine's death was reconsidered, those purchases looked very different. Then there was their family. That night, Jarvie's 15-year-old daughter Elizabeth was putting one of her younger siblings to bed in the next room when she heard her mother crying out. She went in and saw her father standing over her mum with a dose of what he called medicine. Before Catherine died, Elizabeth said her mother told her directly that Jarvey had poisoned her for the woman with the big hat and the cloak. That was not a line added later to make the story darker. It was what Elizabeth swore under oath at both trials. What does it take for a 15-year-old girl to speak against her own father after watching her mother die in front of her? Elizabeth didn't come forward immediately. She held it for 3 months. She still had 5 younger siblings at home, and she still had to live under her father's roof. There was nowhere safe for what she believed she had seen. She finally spoke to authorities on the last day of December 1864, after the woman in the big hat and cloak, Margaret Little, arrived at the house. Little was described as a woman Jarvey was alleged to have been involved with. The prosecution treated that alleged relationship as a possible motive for Catherine's death. Catherine's body was then exhumed from Dunedin's southern cemetery. A woman already buried had to be examined again because seizures no longer explained what had happened. New Zealand had no government analyst at this time, so material from the examination was sent to Melbourne, Australia. Dr. Macadam found strychnine in lethal quantities. The first trial opened in March 1865. Elizabeth's evidence held up under cross-examination. The chemist's evidence held up. But the Melbourne analyst, Dr. Macadam, performed so badly in the witness box that the judge publicly reprimanded him. After 40 hours, the jury could not agree. The case was discharged. The second trial went differently. Elizabeth gave her evidence again. Macadam? Well, this time he never made it. Sailing back to New Zealand to testify a second time, after being publicly reprimanded on the stand at the first, the analyst who had found the strychnine in Catherine's body didn't survive the voyage. He died of exhaustion at sea and never got the chance to face that courtroom again. In his place, his Melbourne colleague, a man named James Kirkland, presented the scientific testimony instead. The second jury took 4 hours to find Jarvey guilty. Jarvey used his final words in court to turn on the witness who had undone him, his own daughter. In court, he reportedly told the room, "That unfortunate girl in that box has sworn my life away. I forgive her, and may God forgive her." The judge didn't let that accusation stand. He told Jarvey straight up that the verdict did not rest on Elizabeth's testimony alone. Standing on the gallows that October afternoon, Jarvey could have looked across Otago Harbour. Contemporary reports described the bay as blue and bright beneath the spring sunshine. Witnesses said he never once looked towards it. Jarvey was hanged at Dunedin jail on the 24th of October 1865, still maintaining his innocence. Now that doesn't undo the conviction, but it leaves the story without a confession at the end. The law got its ending. Jarvey never gave the public theirs. Interest in William Jarvie's head began almost immediately after his execution. Local accounts say a representative connected with the Melbourne Waxworks exhibition was permitted to make a plaster cast of his face and head. Around the same time, a local professor of phrenology was also given access to examine his head, based on the now discredited belief that personality and criminal character could be read from the shape of a person's skull. The plaster death mask still survives today. More importantly, it tells us something else. Long before Jarvey's skull was reported missing, people already considered his head something worth preserving, studying, and displaying. Now, later accounts say Jarvey was buried standing upright beneath the jail grounds. The story attached to that burial was that men considered evil in life should not be allowed an easy rest in death. I like that. He remained beneath the jail for more than 3 decades. In 1899, Jarvey's remains were exhumed for reburial at Northern Cemetery. This is where the surviving story becomes unusually specific. Jarvey's bones were laid out in the jail courtyard while officials prepared to move them. During that window, someone was said to have climbed over the fence. In that version, by the time the remains reached Northern Cemetery, the skull was already gone. That courtyard is the moment at the centre of the entire legend. A set of human remains was being handled by officials in daylight at a controlled site, and the largest, most recognisable bone was said to have disappeared. Nobody was even named in connection with its disappearance. Now, there are 3 realistic explanations. None of them are especially comfortable. The first is medical or pseudoscientific curiosity. Phrenology was nonsense, but in the 19th century, not everyone treated it that way. Some people claimed criminal character could be read in the shape of a skull. Now, local records place a Professor Griffin giving public phrenology lectures in Dunedin around this period. An unnamed professor of phrenology was also said to have examined Jarvey's head after the execution. That gives this theory historical context, but it doesn't identify who, if anyone, took the skull in 1899, or prove that a phrenologist took it at all. Now, the second theory is souvenir hunting. Now, that's pretty grim, but the collecting of relics connected to notorious crimes is well documented elsewhere in this era. Pieces of rope, locks of hair, and scraps taken from execution sites. Some point towards an opportunist taking Jarvey's skull as a trophy, simply because of whose it was. But again, that doesn't name the person responsible. Now, the third theory requires no collector at all, only official carelessness. Old burials are messy and old records can be worse, but a skull is not a splinter of bone. If that detail is accurate and it disappeared during the short period when the remains were laid out in the courtyard, accident becomes harder to accept. Which makes the fact that nobody was ever seen, that nobody was ever named, even harder to understand. Now, that unresolved gap is where this legend begins to make sense. Not because it proves a haunting, but because folklore grows extremely well around unfinished events. The old jail in Northern Cemetery form the map of the legend. The jail is where Jarvey was executed, buried, and later exhumed. The cemetery is where his remains, reportedly without the skull, were finally placed. Headless because the skull was reported missing. Tied to the jail because that is where it was said to have disappeared. Tied to the cemetery because that's where the rest of them ended up. Now, that doesn't prove a ghost walks through Dunedin. It shows how a documented historical mystery gave the legend a shape and somewhere to live. Now, there's one uncomfortable thing that is definitely worth sitting with before we finish. Jarvey was convicted of murdering Catherine, but the legend that survived is almost entirely about him. His execution, his face, his skull, his ghost. Why do some criminals grow larger in memory than their victims? Now, Catherine and Elizabeth are not the headline of the legend, but they can't be written out of this story. Catherine's death is the reason Jarvey was tried. Elizabeth's testimony, given twice under oath as a teenager against her own dad, helped put him on the path to the gallows. Without Elizabeth standing in that witness box, Jarvey may never have reached the gallows. And without that conviction, there is no death mask, no infamous remains, and no mystery of the missing skull. Now, could Jarvey's skull still exist somewhere? It may have been destroyed long ago, or it may have survived in a collection, a box, a cabinet, or a forgotten storage room. Its label lost decades ago, now completely separated from the name that made it infamous. Phrenology, souvenir, carelessness, maybe something else entirely. What do you think happened to William Jarvie's skull? Do you think it was taken as a specimen, stolen as a trophy, or lost through official carelessness? Maybe you have a different explanation. Please let me know in the comments. We can chase Captain William Jarvie from captain to convicted murderer, from gallows to death mask, and from a grave beneath the Dunedin jail to a courtyard in 1899. But the moment we actually want to see, the moment his skull was said to have left that courtyard, well, that's still hidden. Maybe that's why the Headless captain has lasted this long. A complete burial gives a story an ending. A missing head? Well, that leaves a question mark standing in the dark. Behind that legend is still the teenage girl who had to stand in court and say what she heard in the room where her mother died. Until someone can explain what really happened, This legend remains exactly where it's strongest. Between the archive and the cemetery, between the execution record and the legend, between what we can prove and what this city still whispers about after dark. I'm Anthony. This is Southern Static. Stay safe and stay out of the static.